In the 1960s and 70s, a new genre of science fiction emerged called cyberpunk. It was this crazy idea that one day people would plug into something called cyberspace, virtual worlds completely controlled and monitored by mega corporations, more powerful than governments. Thankfully, this dystopia never came to be, but probably the most iconic book in cyberpunk literature is William Gibson's Neuromancer. This is a challenging text. Gibson doesn't explain anything. He just immerses you in his world, and you have to read and reread passages to figure out what's going on. And it's a great book. There was a video game called Neuromancer based on Gibson's work where you bought and upgraded computer hardware and software to go hacking corporate databases and fight intrusion countermeasure electronics, or ICE. The game was all about hacking, and I loved it for that. As a kid, I loved cyberpunk, and the dream of becoming a brilliant technomancer extraordinaire really inspired me to get into computing at a young age. Back then, we didn't have an internet. We had people who left their computers on all day, and my computer would call those computers, and I would get 20 minutes on each one to play text-based video games and argue politics on forums called bulletin board systems, or BBSs. Many of the BBSs had a section for trading games, mostly in violation of copyright, like a lot of modern torrenting. Except you got credits for every kilobyte of data you uploaded that you could then spend to download kilobytes of data. It was really a fascinating community, and I should do a video on it one day, but today I'm talking about 1980s cyberpunk and how it feels antiquated in many ways. Around this same time, there was a cyberpunk-themed tabletop role-playing game that I enjoyed, R. Talsorian's Cyberpunk 2020, the role-playing game of the dark future. The game was rebellious, dirty, and unrefined because the 80s punk scene was raw and proudly lowlife. It was also very problematic in a lot of ways that reflect the biases and ignorance of a 1980s society, which I'm going to cover. My favorite part of these role-playing games were the hackers, called netrunners. These were difficult characters to include in a role-playing campaign because that player would plug into cyberspace and have an awesome solo adventure, while the combat-focused cyborgs players sat around in meat space, twiddling their thumbs, just as the hacker was bored during any street fight. Side note here, this artwork is from another role-playing game of the time, Faz's Shadowrun universe, which had deckers instead of netrunners. I had to use this artwork because Cyberpunk really didn't go very deep into hacking. As inspiring as Cyberpunk 2020 was to me as a youth, it's pretty antiquated in retrospect. For example, it has katanas and archetypes like street samurais, because everyone thought Japan was going to forever rule the technological world in the 1980s. It also heavily objectified women because the 80s were all about appealing to the male gaze, because men had spending power, specifically white men, so protagonists were overwhelmingly white and male. Movies like Death Wish and Dirty Harry reflected white male power fantasies, and Cyberpunk 2020 blends into the other media of the time in that respect. The cybernetics were uncanny and cool, but also stylized to evoke a kind of body horror. This was emphasized by the fact that Cyberpunk 2020 had something called cyberpsychosis, which was an insanity brought on by losing too much of your humanity to cybernetic enhancements. Now, this was problematic and misguided on many levels. Just as in the 1980s, people today have all sorts of cybernetic enhancements. People have prosthetic limbs, they use wheelchairs, have glass eyes, bolted bones, dentures, hearing aids, and other technologies to help them overcome disabilities. Having these enhancements doesn't make anyone less human, and having a game mechanic where players become psycho killers after getting too many of these modifications is pretty offensive. I wore glasses and contacts in the 1980s. Did that make me less human, the way someone who replaces their eyes in Cyberpunk 2020 is less human? Jumping forward in time to the actual year 2020, we have the video game Cyberpunk 2077, which is based heavily on Cyberpunk 2020, and should be understood as having that influence. This is a game I highly anticipated for several years after seeing an extended gameplay demo that was, in retrospect, also highly choreographed. It looks like it has some great hacking in it, and that got me super excited. There's a lot of videos of players hacking all kinds of computer-reliant devices, illustrating the potential pitfalls that come with our currently evolving Internet of Things. I think this was a great bit of futurism relevant to modern society. Unfortunately, my excitement waned pretty quickly when I learned this new video game was true to the source material to the point of including all the problematic styles and themes. It's got the body horror aspect of cybernetic enhancements, evoking 2020's misguided questions about sacrificing our humanity when we enhance our bodies through technology. The cybernetics themselves aren't necessarily bad, but 2077 even incorporates the cyberpsychosis mechanic by having bosses you have to fight who have lost their humanity from getting too many prostheses. This was ignorant in the 1980s, but in the actual 2020s, it's just an absurd idea. It's got a splash of the Japanese fetishism, and that's a nod to the source material, although young players might not realize where this comes from without the historical context. But the history of technology's geography and how Silicon Valley, Japan, India, China, and other countries have all contributed to and continue to contribute to our technological advancement in different ways is very important. Unfortunately, I'm not aware of any of these other countries being incorporated into this vision of the future. It's also got the 1980s objectification of women, which is really feeling more and more anachronistic the further we get into the decade, get away from this decade. Comics, movies, role-playing games back then used to use sex, sex, sex to appeal to the white male gaze and white male money, and now it feels pretty inappropriate and alienating. Except they've updated the objectification to include transgendered and non-binary people, so progress, I guess? Now, critics of this criticism will point out the game does include a transgendered non-player character, but I would counter that the character is not recognizably transgendered and their reassignment surgery is revealed as a footnote. The portrayal is navigated in such a way as to avoid making players even slightly uncomfortable by challenging their social norms. So, Cyberpunk 2077 isn't the future. This is what we thought the future would look like in the 1980s, with all the antiquated, ignorant viewpoints and biases we had back then. And author William Gibson kind of seems to agree on this perspective of it. Also, 2077 isn't punk. I've enjoyed punk for decades. Punk is about challenging social norms for positive change. 2077 has too much reinforcement of old notions of what we thought the future would look like 40 years ago. That's not punk. To paraphrase the movie Salt Lake City Punk, Project CD didn't sell out to the establishment. They bought in. The 1980s did have science fiction media that positively challenged social norms. My most memorable example of this was James Cameron's Aliens, which had the character Vasquez, a tough-as-nails female space marine who, at a time when women weren't allowed into the United States military, and wouldn't be for another decade. Vasquez made me uncomfortable as a youth because she was a complete break with 80s gender norms. I wasn't uncomfortable because I was prejudiced or misogynistic, but because I was ignorant. I quickly got over that and accepted her as the badass protagonist she was. Cameron's Aliens affected social change. That movie was very punk. Today, we can contrast 2077's approach with publisher Wizards of the Coast, who has introduced Nico Eris to their game Magic the Gathering, a non-binary character who is positively portrayed, recognizably non-binary, and it's featured prominently in the game's recent advertising. This has made some players pretty uncomfortable, and I see this come out in online comments about Wizards bringing politics into Magic or complaints about political correctness. And although these criticisms are all reflections of prejudice, which we should condemn, the discomfort is good, because once everyone gets over that discomfort based on ignorance, they'll be more accepting and social norms will change, even if that change is so incremental as to be imperceptible. So, those are my thoughts on 1980s cyberpunk and Cyberpunk 2077. In my next video, I'll seek to cover what I consider some modernized portrayals of cyberpunk that take into account our changing social norms and the issues brought into our world now that we are actually living with these technologies. Just as 1980s cyberpunk inspired me to go into computing, I think a modern, inclusive portrayal of cyberpunk can inspire all young people to see technology as magic, not just privileged white kids like myself. Thank you for watching.